to monitor the Mayaguez throughout the day. As darkness approached, an Air Force AC-130 gunship was dispatched to maintain nighttime surveillance. The gunship closely monitored the Mayaguez and patrol boat activity with its infrared and low light level television sensor system. Gunship sensor imagery was videotaped, and that videotape was in turn transferred to film. In this transfer process, a considerable amount of original detail and sharpness is unavoidably lost. There are, however, no other sources of motion picture coverage available. Therefore, the gunship imagery is used extensively in this film. Infrared imagery displays a picture based upon differences in temperature. It can be displayed with white, representing heat, as shown by the white smokestack, or black, representing heat, as shown here. IR imagery has a grid in the middle of the screen. The grid for TV imagery, however, covers the entire screen. Also, slant range to the target sometimes appears in the upper left-hand corner of TV imagery. In this case, a target range of some 10,000 feet, or about 2 miles, is indicated. With that brief explanation in mind, we now turn to the story of military operations to recover the SS Mayaguez and her crew. When the first gunship arrived over the Mayaguez, patrol boats were active in the area. The basic pattern of boat activity consisted of shuttling the 1.5 miles between the Mayaguez and a cluster of boats in a cove on the eastern side of the island. Boats occasionally left the cluster and went to shore near an encampment area at the center of the eastern beach, which was the hub of activity and was considered to be a possible location for detention of the Mayaguez crew. The boat activity continued throughout the entire night of the 13th. For example, at about 2100, these 2 boats approached the Mayaguez and, using their spotlights, tied up alongside. Later, an RF-4 was seen on gunship sensors as it flew over the Mayaguez, taking nighttime photography. The light from the RF-4's photo flashes was clearly visible on the ship. Meanwhile, boat activity continued in the cove near the encampment. Related movement on the beach was clearly visible on the sensors. Watch the black spot emerge from the tree line and move down the white beach to the water's edge. The object was unidentified, but was fairly large. It could, for example, have been a barrel of fuel being rolled down to the water. Moments later, it was loaded aboard a boat in the shallow water just off the beach. While these shuttling activities were underway, AC-130 gunships were repeatedly fired upon by forces in the encampment and on the boats. The gunships were not authorized to return the fire. Safety of the Mayaguez crew, whose whereabouts was unknown, was paramount. In retrospect, this decision proved wise. Days later, when the crew was recovered and interviewed, it would be learned that they spent the night of the 13th and the morning of the 14th on one of these boats in the cove off the eastern beach. But to the gunships on scene at the time, of course, that was unknown. Although return fire was not authorized, the gunships were directed to discourage movement of the boats to the Cambodian mainland by firing warning shots across their bows. Until about 0300, the boats remained in the cove vicinity and no warning shots were fired. At that time, however, one of the boats left the cluster and headed away from the cove. At about 0400, when it appeared that the patrol boat could be heading toward the mainland, U.S. activities entered a new phase. Containment of the gunboats was initiated to prevent movement of the crew away from the Koh Tang area. Time after time, the gunship fired in the path of the patrol boat to turn it back toward Koh Tang. The bright spot on the boat represents heat from its engine. For nearly an hour, the boat continued its attempt to break for the mainland, but gunship rounds off the bow prompted it to give up. The patrol boat finally stopped, apparently running aground in shallow water at a small island near Koh Tang. Gunships continued to hinder patrol boat activity in the pre-dawn hours. After dawn on the 14th, the gunships returned to base, and tactical aircraft took over the task of containing the gunboats in the vicinity of Koh Tang. During the morning of the 14th, Mayaguez operations entered another stage. If warning shots did not deter boats from approaching or departing the Koh Tang area, U.S. tactical aircraft were authorized to strike the boats. At this time, a fishing boat carrying a large number of passengers was sighted heading for the mainland. Repeated warning shots and riot control agent delivered by tactical aircraft failed to turn the boat around. Since it was not known whether any of the passengers were Mayaguez crew members, the boat was not struck. Other boats active in the area, however, were carrying no passengers. A-7s and F-4s sunk, beached, or damaged a number of gunboats. One is shown in this photograph underwater in the cove near the eastern beach. Another boat is shown here, sinking after being strafed with 20-millimeter cannon fire. As darkness fell on the 14th, gunships returned to Koh Tang. Near midnight, a gunship attacked and damaged this enemy patrol boat. The same gunship later scored a direct hit on a boat which was beached near the encampment at Koh Tang. Up to this point, aerial surveillance and air attacks against gunboats were about the only measures open to the limited U.S. forces within reach of the Koh Tang area. In the meantime, however, additional forces were being brought into place so they could respond to any military action which might be directed. Air Force C-141s rushed a Marine unit from Okinawa to a staging base at Utapao, Thailand. Air Force CH and HH-53 helicopters from Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, also flew to Utapao. These helicopters and crews would prove to be a decisive factor in the final outcome of Mayaguez operations. Air Force strike and reconnaissance aircraft were standing by in Thailand to provide air support, and U.S. Navy vessels were bearing down on the Koh Tang area at top speed. Then, with U.S. forces gathering in reach of Koh Tang, National Command authorities gave orders to recover the Mayaguez and to land on and search Koh Tang Island for any crew members who might be held there. Since one fishing boat had reached the mainland, it was possible that some crew members were already beyond the reach of U.S. forces. On the basis of the heavy boat activity between the Mayaguez and Koh Tang, however, there was a strong possibility that all or most of the crew was on the island. In the early morning hours of the 15th, minutes after the execute order was given, 11 Air Force CH-53 and HH-53 helicopters were on their way to Koh Tang. 3 were to deliver Mayaguez boarding parties to the USS Harold E. Holt, a U.S. Navy destroyer escort. The other 8 helicopters were to deliver some 200 Marines to Koh Tang Island to search for and recover the Mayaguez crew. After delivering the men, the helicopters were to return to Utapao to unload a second wave of Marines destined for Koh Tang. The 3 helicopters scheduled to land on the Holt faced a challenging task since the ship's landing pad was designed and stressed for much smaller helicopters. Each aircraft had to rest its nose gear on the deck and maintain a partial hover to get the boarding parties aboard. While the 3 helicopters were offloading at the Holt, the first of the other 8 were beginning the assault on Koh Tang. The mission of the operation, safe recovery of the Mayaguez crew, imposed 2 restrictions. First, the landing would have to take place on the 2 beaches at the northern tip of the island. This offered the only hope for rapid access to the Mayaguez crew, which was believed to be held in the encampment. Second, safety of the crew precluded softening the landing zones by preparatory airstrikes. The helicopters would have to rely on the element of surprise and on their own organic minigun firepower for initial protection. U.S. aircraft were, however, standing by overhead should they be needed. The first 4 helicopters to reach Koh Tang began simultaneous landings at the 2 beaches. As soon as the Cambodians fired their first volley, it was plain that resistance was going to be much greater than expected. By that time, however, it was already too late to turn back, as 3 helicopters had immediately been shot down. 14 men had died, and the survivors, many of them wounded, were divided between the 2 beaches and were under heavy fire. From here on out, the men on the beaches as well as the Mayaguez crew were at stake. What followed was a day-long struggle to stabilize the situation at Koh Tang, and after the crew was later recovered, to withdraw from the island with a minimum of casualties. Here, in more detail, is what happened during those first minutes of the initial island assault. As the first 2 helicopters reached the western beach, no fire was encountered. Then, as the Marines began offloading, the enemy opened up from entrenched positions. Both helicopters were severely damaged. One was able to deliver its Marines, but then had to ditch in the ocean off Koh Tang. One Air Force crew member was lost. Minutes later, after a futile attempt to deliver its Marines, the other helicopter was forced to withdraw. It barely reached the Thai coast before being forced down by battle damage. Enemy fire on the eastern beach was even heavier. Both helicopters attempting initial insertions were shot down immediately. One exploded in flames. Of 26 on board, 13 were killed in the crash or by heavy machine gun fire. Several others, trapped inside, would also have died were it not for one of the flight mechanics. He re-entered the burning aircraft to retrieve his rifle. Seeing the men trapped inside, he led them through the exit, which was under the waterline. All 13 survivors, many of them burned or shot, helped each other swim to sea and were later picked up. The 25 men on the second helicopter ran through a hail of enemy fire and managed to reach the tree line at the top of the eastern beach. One flight mechanic was knocked to the ground twice, but somehow got up again and stumbled to the tree line. Although he had suffered 5 gunshot wounds, medical attention by his comrades would save his life. Considering the intense fire encountered by these first 2 aircraft, the rest of the helicopters scheduled to land here were diverted to the western beach. The distance separating the 2 beaches was only 400 meters, and enemy forces were entrenched throughout the neck area. This, together with the fluid battlefield situation and the uncertain location of friendly forces, made the cautious use of air support mandatory. The on-station A7 FAC went to work to pinpoint the sources of fire so that airstrikes could be applied. Minutes later, the F-4 shown here flew in to strafe hostile positions near the eastern beach. Meanwhile, on the western side of the island neck, one of the 4 helicopters in the second assault wave had picked up the survivors from the chopper which ditched earlier. The recovered crew members, having just been shot down, their hair and clothes soaked with gasoline and water, found themselves going back into the western beach for a second time. They quickly manned weapons to help suppress fire during the landing. Their helicopter and 2 others sustained heavy damage, but were able to deliver their Marines. The 4th helicopter was driven away from the beach each time it tried to touch down. A total of 60 Marines were now in the immediate area of the western beach, and 29 more were located some distance south of that beach. Enemy forces were between the 2 groups on the western side of the island neck. They were also between the western groups and the friendly forces on the eastern beach. There was no sign of the Mayaguez crew. In the meantime, the USS Holt had pulled up alongside the Mayaguez, and an armed party boarded the ship without incident. The party found neither crew members nor enemy forces on board. With the assault on Koh Tang running into stiff resistance, and the whereabouts of the Mayaguez crew still a mystery, hopes for safely and rapidly recovering the crew seemed to have vanished. About 2 hours had passed since the initial helicopter assault, With the one empty helicopter remaining in the Koh Tang area, a rescue attempt was launched to recover the 25 survivors isolated on the eastern beach. Under intense enemy fire, the helicopter reached the eastern beach and prepared to touch down. Then, hopes for rapidly recovering the 25 men on the beach ended as flames engulfed the aircraft. With its jettisoned flare case burning in the water behind it and its auxiliary fuel tank on fire, the badly damaged helicopter struggled away from the island. Moments later, the flames blew out, and the helicopter subsequently made it to Thailand. As shown in these photos of the helicopter's fuel tank, damage to the chopper was severe. Fortunately, no serious crew injuries were reported. The pilot, however, had an especially close call. A round entered the cockpit and smashed into his instrument panel. The bullet, pointing at him, had spent itself just before breaking through. During the unsuccessful rescue attempt, enemy fire had been seen coming from the woods and also from the encampment area. The A-7 FAC quickly laid down a marking round in the encampment next to hostile positions which had just revealed themselves. Air Force A-7s and F-4s then struck the positions with rockets and general-purpose ordnance. On the western side of the island neck, the last of the initial 8 helicopters, shown here, was still encountering heavy machine gun and mortar fire. It had been attempting to deliver its Marines for more than 2 hours. An AC-130 gunship arrived on scene and finally managed to pinpoint the locations of the 2 Marine groups in the western neck area. The AC-130 then laid down 40-millimeter Mish metal rounds against forces entrenched between the 2 Marine groups and helped blunt fire, which was preventing further insertion of Marines. Finally, the 8th helicopter succeeded in delivering the last load of the initial assault wave. While this struggle was underway, U.S. Navy aircraft from the USS Coral Sea were making the first in a series of airstrikes against military facilities at nearby Ream and Kampong Som. The strikes were intended to apply maximum pressure against the Cambodians and to prevent them from using the 2 bases to launch an attack against U.S. forces at Koh Tang. In the meantime, the Holt was towing the Mayaguez away from the Koh Tang area. Then a fishing boat, flying a white flag, approached Koh Tang from the direction of the mainland. The USS Henry B. Wilson, a guided missile destroyer, intercepted the fishing boat, and by 1000, the entire Mayaguez crew was safely aboard. Without the slightest prior indication, the Cambodians had suddenly released the entire Mayaguez crew. The crew of the Thai fishing boat was also released. This was the same boat which had, 1 day earlier, been allowed to pass to the mainland. It was now apparent that the Mayaguez crew had been onboarded after all, and the decision not to strike the boat had saved their lives. With the crew of the Mayaguez recovered, total attention shifted to the extraction of the Marines, who were split up and under fire at Koh Tang. First, reinforcements were needed to stabilize the military situation on the western side of the island before the withdrawal could safely begin. Next, the small force still on the eastern beach would have to be extracted from its untenable position. Although all but one of the helicopters participating in the insertion attempts at Koh Tang had either been destroyed or heavily damaged, intense repair efforts were underway, and every available helicopter was pressed into service. By just after noon, the number of Marines in the vicinity of the western beach had grown to over 200, and Marine units on the western neck were able to link up. With the situation at the western beach stabilized, the key to withdrawal from Koh Tang was evacuation of the men from the eastern beach. After preparatory airstrikes, A-7s dispensed riot control agent, and 2 helicopters flew in for another recovery attempt. As shown here, a strong wind blew the cloud over the water, and it offered little protection. Resistance was again intense. A mortar blast knocked down 1 pararescue man in the lead helicopter. Although wounded in the shoulder, he got back up and continued to man his minigun. Then enemy fire ruptured the helicopter's fuel line, causing the loss of one engine and spewing raw fuel into the cabin. With all hope of completing the recovery gone, the pilot and co-pilot nursed the aircraft out of the landing zone with its only remaining engine. Fortunately, by this time, the USS Coral Sea had closed to within 70 miles of Koh Tang, and the helicopter, with no fuel to spare, barely made it to the ship, the first carrier landing ever for the pilot or any of the crew members. These crew members had to get back to Koh Tang as time was running out. With help from Coral Sea personnel, the crew hastily repaired the ruptured fuel line with a piece of rubber hose and some tape. This action would later prove a crucial factor in the evacuation of the Marines. Back at the eastern beach, the survivors, dug in at the tree line, radioed that accurate fire was coming from the deck of the beach patrol boat during the recovery attempt. Minutes later, the boat was strafed by A-7s, and the USS Wilson volunteered to finish it off with naval gunfire. At that time, approximately 1600, two OV-10s arrived to relieve the A-7 FACs. As soon as one of the OV-10s had assumed control, the Wilson started shelling the patrol boat. As naval gunfire zeroed in, a half-dozen soldiers scrambled to the deck, but were killed in the next instant by a direct hit. The OV-10 FAC then focused his efforts on pinpointing the Marine positions penetrating across the island's neck from the western beach. Firing his marking rockets, the OV-10 soon located the Marines. They were in the small cleared area, almost halfway across the neck. The FAC then knew that ground movement he had observed between the clearing and the eastern beach was hostile. The FAC brought in F-4s and A-7s to rocket, bomb, and strafe well-concealed positions in the vicinity of the enemy encampment and in the jungle surrounding the men on the eastern beach. When the OV-10 dropped down to take a close look, he saw the strikes were right on target. Remaining enemy forces refused to fire at the low-flying FAC and thus revealed their position. With darkness approaching, time was running out for the men on the eastern beach. Attention shifted from further strikes to a third recovery attempt. 3 helicopters flew in with their miniguns raking the shoreline, while the OV-10 orbited above to provide rocket and machine gun fire. As the lead helicopter touched down, the men at the tree line began an orderly withdrawal, stopping every few feet to fire their weapons. Enemy resistance was almost fanatical. Cambodian soldiers, seeing the Americans escaping from their grasp, stormed the helicopter to attain hand grenade range. Just as a grenade was being thrown, the soldiers were cut down by fire from the helicopter's crew. The grenade fell short and exploded on the beach. Despite the intense resistance, the helicopters held their positions and continued the rescue attempt. An Air Force photographer snapped this photo as he looked out of the back end of the helicopter at the Marines, the rocky beach, and the surf. In the failing light, the 25 Marines and Air Force crew members, trapped all day on the eastern beach, were finally recovered. The rescue helicopter sustained major battle damage, but was able to fly safely to the USS Coral Sea and land. It was approximately at this time that an Air Force C-130 dropped a huge BLU-82B 15,000-pound bomb on Koh Tang. The cleared area at the center of the crater was 100 meters across, an area larger than a football field. At this time, it was feared that another survivor might be left on board the downed chopper near the top of the eastern beach. Knowing that this would be the last chance out for any man there, 2 helicopter crews flew in to inspect the wreckage. An AC-130 and an A-7 provided suppressive fire, yet heavy resistance was again encountered. One chopper was badly damaged, but refused to withdraw until verifying that there was no survivor in the downed helicopter. The evacuation of the eastern beach was complete, and operations entered their final phase, withdrawal of the main Marine force from the western beach. By now, battle damage had reduced the number of available helicopters to only 3. Under normal circumstances, this would have prevented evacuation because of the long distance to Utapao. The presence of the USS Coral Sea over the horizon, however, provided an offloading and refueling platform which, in effect, multiplied evacuation capabilities. The 3 helicopters flew in for the first wave of extractions in near total darkness. The first helicopter into the western beach is shown in the middle of the grid. Marines heading for the helicopter were barely visible as tiny specks seen moving up the beach. The second helicopter into the beach was the same one which had earlier been repaired at the Coral Sea with a length of rubber hose. It picked up 54 Marines, the record for any single load during the entire operation. The crew would also set another record before the day was out, logging more than 16 hours of nearly continuous flying time. Minutes later, the third helicopter was loaded to capacity, and all 3 departed Koh Tang. The third, if it could quickly offload, had enough fuel remaining for another extraction attempt. Just at this point, radio contact was lost with the Marines on the beach. In a bid to save time, the chopper diverted to the nearby USS Holt, which was standing by just off the western beach. Even in the day, offloading on the Holt had proven challenging. At night, with their landing lights shot out, and with no experience landing on a ship of any kind, the pilot and crew faced a seemingly impossible task, but they somehow did it. Within minutes, the helicopter had successfully offloaded at the Holt and was back into the western beach. Moments later, it lifted off and headed to the Coral Sea with another full load of Marines. The most crucial phase of extraction operations had now arrived. 29 Marines were still on the beach in danger of being overrun, and no helicopters were immediately available to extract them. Air power would have to hold the enemy back. While an Air Force helicopter raced from the USS Coral Sea to Koh Tang, an AC-130 gunship shelled positions surrounding the friendly perimeter. Within minutes, the helicopter had arrived and flew in to extract the last men from the western beach. 3 times it tried to penetrate the darkness, smoke, and enemy fire to reach the short patch of sand in the landing zone, but failed. Finally, on the 4th attempt, the helicopter reached the beach and started to take on the Marines. Before leaving, a member of the crew ran to the tree line to locate any remaining survivors and return with the last 2 men in the beach area. After 14 hours at Koh Tang, the last Marines were on their way to the Coral Sea. Air Force aircraft continued to scan the eastern and western beaches for any additional survivors, while head counts were made among evacuated personnel. Even during these last minutes, fire continued to be directed against U.S. aircraft. Anti-aircraft tracer rounds were clearly visible from the same western beach just evacuated by the Marines. At approximately 20-30 hours, when it was apparent that there were no more Marines on the beaches, further recovery operations were terminated. As U.S. aircraft departed, a fire still burned in the leveled enemy encampment, and an abandoned strobe light blinked on the western beach. U.S. casualties during operations at Koh Tang were 15 killed, 3 missing, and approximately 50 wounded by hostile action. All 15 deaths occurred during the first 2 hours of the assault. Helicopter reinforcement and evacuation of Koh Tang and medical evacuation of wounded throughout the day were instrumental in preventing the toll from climbing higher. During operations at Koh Tang, 13 of the 14 participating helicopters sustained battle damage. 3 of the 13 helicopters were lost, and another 3 were forced down in Thailand before they could reach Utapao. Damage to the remaining helicopters was extensive. Despite this, a small number of Air Force helicopters, under the most difficult of circumstances, were able to withdraw some 230 Marines from the beaches at Koh Tang. As the last helicopter from Koh Tang touched down on the Coral Sea, 4 days of uncertainty and fast-moving events drew to a close. U.S. forces flung across the Pacific had responded rapidly to each new phase of Mayaguez operations: surveillance on the 13th, containment and destruction of gunboats on the 14th, and recovery of the Mayaguez and the assault on Koh Tang on the 15th. After a grim start, operations at Koh Tang had ended on a positive note. The Mayaguez was steaming to port with her crew, and some 230 Marines had been withdrawn from Koh Tang. The final outcome, however, had not been decided until the last minutes of the operation. It was a team effort characterized by repeated incidents of individual heroism that made the difference at Koh Tang. There was no better example of this bravery than the intense personal commitment and determination of U.S. Air Force helicopter crews. They recognized the dangers and odds facing them, yet time and again flew into lethal enemy fire until the last Americans were off the beaches at Koh Tang. The success of the operation to recover the SS Mayaguez and her crew represented, in the words of General George S. Brown, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an outstanding display of the versatility, dedication, and professional competence of all participants. The overall operation, fraught with unknowns from the outset and extremely difficult to execute even under the best of conditions, was conducted by all airmen, sailors, and Marines in the highest traditions of our armed forces.